to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kalugin here with our 92nd episode. We're getting close to the 100th episode of World War Now, so be sure to click down below, subscribe, worldwarnow.co, join, become one of the thousands of subscribers on our Substack, subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, _worldwarnow_, help us, get all the way up there as we get to our 100th episode, because it's been quite the ride here as World War III continues to unfold. We are coming at you in the immediate aftermath of the Israeli retaliation to the huge Iranian strikes, which I believe were on, October 1st, or was it a little bit later than that? I'm forgetting the exact dates, but this is the Israeli retaliation to the big Iranian response that hit the Nevatim air base. And, everyone remembers the very now iconic, very striking images of the Iranian ballistic missile striking down across the territory of the Zionist entity. And now we have seen the Israeli response, apparently, which, underwhelming to say the least. We're going to get into all the details. We are also coming at you in the midst of the aftermath of the Georgian election. It seems that there might be a color revolution brewing, so we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the BRICS 2024 summit in Kazan. Some interesting things going on there. A lot of talk in the alternative media, some hype about some things that, frankly, were not said. We're going to talk about this North Korean troop situation in Ukraine, as well as, the frontline updates, obviously in Lebanon with Hezbollah and Israel, as well as the proxy situation in Syria and just the general expanding front in the Levant, like we do. Of course, some Africa situations, a few things from the East, and then some church updates, of course, like we always do. And we may go a few other places depending where it takes us. But it's a jam-packed episode. World War III marches on, many prophecies becoming relevant, of course. Metropolitan Neophytos, we've been posting some more things about him. Dimitri, how are you doing? It's been a pretty busy week.
It definitely has been, Conrad. Good to be here to all of our listeners and yourself. Look, I think you were correct. It was on the 1st of October that those strikes by Iran on the Israeli territory, over 200 missiles were launched. And we did see less than 24 hours ago, actually, as we're recording this, the Israeli retaliation against Iran. In particular, those targets were the Ilam Oblast, the Khuzestan Oblast of Iran, and of course, Tehran itself, those surrounding outskirts of the city. And essentially at this point in time, given a day after these strikes by Israel, Israel has proclaimed that it hit all of the targets that it was aiming for successfully, and these targets were primarily military targets. The most important thing was that Iran allegedly stated that Israel was not allowed to officially strike any nuclear targets, any targets of nuclear significance, such as nuclear energy related. Again, we spoke about this last week, the significance of potentially Russian and international specialists working, nuclear physicists, etc., scientists, engineers working at these stations in Iran. And of course, this ties in together with the prophecies of Israel potentially striking against Iranian and Persian nuclear facilities. And that wasn't done yesterday. So that's quite a big move, as well as Iranian oil refineries. Iran does not export as much oil as some of the other countries, or even as much as it could potentially. Since the Iranian Revolution, for whatever reason, Iranian oil production and export has gone down significantly. But nevertheless, Israel struck in particular some arms depots and some military bases. So it is curious as to why Iran is officially reporting that these strikes caused so-called limited damage, in addition to striking Iran, these Israeli planes. And at this point, Conrad, it's reported that exactly which force the Israelis used. They used long-range planes. So just as we spoke about with Syrian Girl in our 8th hour episode about 3 episodes back, definitely go listen to that. We spoke about the potential Israeli retaliation, and that retaliation would have been in the form of long-range flights, which we've seen Israel conduct against the Houthis in Yemen, which are flights hundreds of kilometers away. So Israeli pilots are already at the high end of their skill, and they've already practiced having these long flights and then, of course, aiming correctly, bombing some of these key targets. And this is what they've done over Iran at this point. So they've struck over 20 targets in Iran, as well as Syria and Iraq combined. Again, targets related allegedly to the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The curious thing is that Iran is claiming that the losses aren't significant. There were officially 4 Iranian personnel related to the military who have died. And most likely, Conrad, the reason that the damage and the losses are so minimal is because Israel chose to strike Iran in the middle of the night at 2:15 a.m., which I think is very important. It's almost as if Israel wanted to save face, at the same time show that it was willing to retaliate. But again, 3.5 weeks, almost 4 weeks after the 1st of October. So we have to keep this in mind. It was very much a delayed strike, and the strike taking place in the middle of the night when all of the military personnel were at home sleeping, not actually at these bases, minimize the damage against Iran, and potentially will also reduce the risk of Iran striking Israel back again. Although Iranian officials have already announced that they're willing to analyze the damage and the losses, and potentially there will be a retaliation. Now, despite this, we have some Middle Eastern consensus, which is quite rare. We have countries such as Oman, Syria, Jordan, Kuwait, Iraq, Egypt, as well as Saudi Arabia, jointly all condemning Israel's strike against Iran as a potential new point of instability in the region. So we have all these countries from different political perspectives, countries aligned with the US and aligned with Israel, and those countries even perhaps looking more amicably towards Iran, all jointly condemning this Israeli strike, because again, it has forced us to reconsider the fact that there is a peaceful sort of consensus coming to the Middle East. Again, now the tit for tat game, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth revenge strike has taken place. So again, the conflict has reignited. And unfortunately, despite the fact that President Pezeshkian of Iran actually visited BRICS, the Kazan summit in Russia at the time, this did not deter Israel's strikes against Iran, which is also very curious. Israel almost disrespectfully towards Russia, showing the Russians that they do not care about these S-300, S-400, potentially these systems that Russia was shipping to Iran. The other thing is that if there were S-400 systems, which are these anti-air defense batteries, which can apparently shoot down even stealth planes and detect them in the sky, the question is, why didn't they shoot down any of these Israeli warplanes and jets that flew over essentially the entire territory of Iran? They didn't strike from far away. They actually flew into Iranian airspace and then flew out quite safely. We don't have any reports of Israeli planes or Israeli drones being shot down. So that's also a point of contention here. It's like, well, did the Russians actually officially ship equipment to the Iranians? Have Iranians not set them up yet? There are real questions regarding Iranian air defense and what exactly their capacity is to defend their own land, because Israel just showed Iran that they do not care about Iranian defenses. They're willing to fly some of their best warplanes, such as the S-35s and the F-15s, over Iranian space and essentially strike at any targets that they wish. And so it's really a strike of disrespect, a slap across Iran's cheek. But will Iran turn the other cheek and simply forget about this strike, or will it escalate further?
Well, I think that's the question. Many people have speculated that at least some of these attacks were probing attacks, hoping to identify specific, expensive, the really big and important Iranian air defenses. But again, now we have even the Israeli generals claiming that, their limited strike on these military targets is the end of it. I mean, I'm seeing polls and like huge Israeli nationalist Telegram channels, like 80, 90% of people are saying that they don't feel satisfied by this retaliation. Of course, Hezbollah has also been dramatically increasing its strikes on Israel. They even issued evacuation warrants for 25 towns in northern Israel, which they don't even usually do things like that. Israel are the ones that have been, issuing the evacuation warnings all throughout southern Lebanon. But of course, Hezbollah also targeted Netanyahu's home with a drone, which, everybody, they banged the drum about that and said how dramatic it was and are hoping that they will retaliate. And I guess they don't count the retaliation against Iran as this retaliation against Hezbollah, despite the fact that, they're killing Hamas people in Iran, they're killing IRGC people in Lebanon while they kill the Hezbollah leaders. So I don't know why they're segmenting all of this out, but I think the main reason why the strike was the way it was that the U.S. really is yanking the chain of Israel and is not wanting to continue to go along with what they want to do. I was anticipating a larger strike because we heard that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were quote unquote, satisfied and happy with the apparent plans. But remember, apparently the plans were actually delayed in the midst of this big leak from the State Department or from the DOD, I believe the Pentagon. And it had kind of outlined a lot of the plans, the specific planes and other things that were going to be used in the Israeli strike and what was going to be targeted. And then the big Israeli disinformation machine tried to spin it as this specific Iranian Pentagon worker who I guess had been accused of something in the past, and the Israelis were quickly trying to spin the leak as some kind of Iranian breach, just like, of course, they're trying to spin the Trump assassination stuff as an Iranian, some kind of Iranian psyop to continue to gaslight the American people and create quote-unquote organic support for, war with Iran or supporting Israel's campaigns against Iran. But again, you mentioned that Iran is also kind of downplaying and saying how successful their air defenses were, hyping up their, like you said, the Iranian Iron Dome. I doubt they call it David's Sling or any of those things. I don't know exactly what all of their air defenses are called. And of course, we know that the THAAD air defenses, the Americans are there. I believe there's two THAAD air defense systems there. At least the Israelis had asked for multiple others after the first ones arrived. And those are, the batteries for those are $1 billion. And the Iranians said that in the midst of an Israeli attack, that their response would target those THAAD, ammunition, those THAAD missile batteries. So we've gotten different reports out of Iran from different officials that there will be a response, that there won't be a response. I highly doubt that if this is the end of the attack, I highly doubt they will respond. Iran, we know, doesn't want to escalate. And this response, if this is truly it, was not escalatory. It was them showing that they want to de-escalate, or they're, again, preparing for something else. People have said that it happened specifically on this day on this Jewish holiday, but other people say that they couldn't do it on this Jewish holiday because certain Jews wouldn't want to operate, the missiles or anything. I don't know. I think Israel has enough people that don't care about that stuff to where that doesn't matter. But the thing in Iran is, even though they are hyping up the fact that they, quote unquote, successfully, repelled the attack, members of the Iranian army were killed, which is different than the IRGC. Like the IRGC, they report to the Ayatollah, they operate the axis of resistance. That's kind of the main thing that they do. They obviously also operate, I think, a lot of the Navy and the Air Force that is relevant in Iran, but the Iranian army also have their own branches of the army and the Navy and the Air Force. And the actual, like, if there was a war with the US and Iran, the majority of people fighting would be in the Iranian army, not the IRGC. The Iranian army is, they would answer to the president, and they are, the standing army of Iran, and are much more like the US army. It's not this kind of paramilitary force. This, the IRGC is almost like, it's like the SS was to Hitler. The IRGC is to the Ayatollah. I'm not, saying that in a derogatory way. I'm just saying it in a, much like the SS, those were like the vanguard of the National Socialist Party. The IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, like, what are they guarding? They're guarding the revolution, the ideology of the Islamic Revolution. They are, the purists. They're the ones that want to destroy Israel. And then you've got Pezeshkian and these other moderates that are like, no, we want to have a nuclear program and, have deals with the U.S. and be integrated into the international system, all these kinds of things. So that's going on right now. And I don't know, by the time you're listening to this, maybe there will be more strikes by Israel. Maybe Iran will do something. It seems to me, as of right now, though, that the biggest front right now in that region is still between Hezbollah and Israel has not taken much territory. They claim that their action is coming close to an end. They've claimed that perhaps their goal is to only establish a 10-kilometer buffer zone into Lebanon, but that may only have been corrected after they've faced such steep resistance on the ground. They're having a very hard time holding specific territory. They've had to retreat at numerous situations. And again, they might be trying to, do more of a, strike and really deplete Hezbollah's manpower and their caches of missiles and everything, and their weapons caches, which again, Israel keeps complaining about how many Russian weapons they're finding with Hezbollah. And we know that we saw the Iranian air defenses, and we've seen Hezbollah air defenses actually active. I don't know what kind of air defenses those were, but I think you might have seen those videos as well, Dimitri, of Hezbollah air defense active defending against Israeli strikes. Israel also did strike Syria and Damascus and Iranian proxy targets in Iraq and Syria and other places during their retaliation against Iran. So that all did definitely take place. Also, Israel struck Al-Mayadeen, the news source. We've cited them a lot on World War Now, Telegram, Twitter, and whatnot. Their offices in Lebanon were completely destroyed, and people were killed by Israel. So, Israel is ramping everything up against Lebanon. And we know that the, second in command, actually, Nasrallah's cousin, was killed. Dimitri, if you want to give us an update on the situation in Hezbollah's leadership right now, as Israel continues to, with Hamas and with Hezbollah and with other resistance groups, they continue to decapitate them. It seems only the Houthis have managed to somewhat protect their highest leadership.
Yeah, that's right. Unfortunately for the Lebanese people and Hezbollah in particular, Israel confirmed allegedly, again, Hezbollah has not confirmed it, but Hashem Saifuddin, the cousin, a relative of Nasrallah, Sayyid, a very high-ranking religious as well as political leader, and now, the first elected leader after Nasrallah of Hezbollah, has been killed in an airstrike in southern Beirut, so very close to the place where actually Hezbollah's former leader Nasrallah was killed as well. And so Israel is taking out these Hezbollah leaders and chiefs as well as the leaders of Hamas seemingly in very orderly fashion. Almost every second week we have a certain leader of one of these two groups being taken out. And in retaliation, Conrad, I think all we really see, at least from Hezbollah at the moment, was the suicide drone attack on the on the summer home of Netanyahu in Caesarea, which is south of Haifa, quite far away actually from the Lebanese-Israeli border. That was quite a curious drone strike against his holiday home, essentially blew up the entire backyard, shattered the windows on his house. But what's curious again is that this was placated everywhere as a huge victory and a slap in the face of the mighty Benjamin Netanyahu, when in fact that he probably owns multiple homes and is a real estate mogul. If you think about his position and his long-term tenureship in Israeli politics, this is probably not the only house he owns. And certainly he wasn't located there. He was most likely sitting somewhere in a bunker or at a military base in Israel, given that there are real probably assassination strikes going out against him. It's just interesting how the propaganda machine works on either side, on both the axis of resistance side as well as on that of the Israelis. But I suppose any small victory, even one of disrespect against, works in the favor of the axis of resistance at this point. The other sort of point of propaganda I think is very interesting. It came out actually on the same day as the announcement of Soefadin's assassination. It was a Hezbollah releasing a very HD video clip of one of their underground bases. It was a Imad 4 missile facility located in a secret location in Lebanon. Essentially, you had like this underground base, all these missiles located in boxes. You had Hezbollah personnel dressed in fully modern sort of military gear, equipped with helmets. You had motorcycles on the ground, and of course, massive Hezbollah flags everywhere. And then following the video, they stated the estimated, or at least the official losses according to Hezbollah, of the Israelis that they've lost since the beginning of the Lebanon invasion, which amount to, according to the Hezbollah video, 70 dead Israelis, 600 Israelis injured, 28 Merkava tanks destroyed, 4 military bulldozers destroyed, some other Israeli drones, and more armored vehicles. So, in fact, Hezbollah statistics, they don't really go overboard here. They don't claim hundreds of Israeli soldiers killed or anything, which makes me think that these statistics are actually more or less realistic, given the 3 weeks or so of combat that we've seen in southern Lebanon, which has been very, very limited. But Hezbollah is claiming that, yes, these are the losses thus far. And to me, they seem somewhat believable. It's really interesting, especially when we compare to some of the statistics given out by the Ukrainians in our further segment about the Kursk offensive taking place there. Meanwhile, the fight against Hamas, again, is never really stopping. Northern Gaza, despite the fact that Israel essentially took complete control of it, still has certain Hamas underground tunnels and essentially cells which are still operating, which has turned northern Gaza into essentially a no man's land. Apparently people are not allowed to really leave their homes. Those homes which are not destroyed by the Israeli warplanes essentially are always under surveillance. And if Israel suspects that a certain apartment building or a house has Hamas personnel hiding beneath it, of course the house is bombed. The best example of this was this week, actually, a horrendous strike against a multi-story building, killing 35 Palestinians in one round of bombing, which is considerable amount of lives lost tragically. And these are 35 innocent Palestinians. They're not even counting the Hamas militants who were apparently killed beneath the building itself. And this was in Beit Lahaya. And the death toll is apparently expected to rise as well. It's most likely more than 35. And again, the Israeli military has been stormed another hospital, according to Al Jazeera, which is the Kamal Adwan hospital. Again, they're suspecting that Hamas is using these hospitals as, these hospitals have very large basements. They're using them as sort of storage facilities or as temporary bases for some of their troops. Whether or not these claims are justified, I'm not too sure. Again, it's difficult to trust the Israeli media and the Israeli war machine. They've been known to exaggerate and lie about some of their claims, as well as brush off these, accusations of innocents being killed in this conflict, which makes reporting and analyzing this news extremely complicated. And really, the death toll of the Palestinians really is painting a very different picture. It seems that Israel is quite reckless in the way it's bombing some of these sites. But yes, Hamas is continuing to fight on despite the loss of Yahya Sinwar. The leadership of Hamas has not really announced who their new head is, who the new sort of official replacement of Hamas is, but nevertheless, the fighting of the axis of resistance in Palestine continues, and it's not looking to stop anytime soon. And again, this strike against Netanyahu, I think it's really showing that Hezbollah is willing to strike very far deep into Israeli territory, willing to send these drones that far south, almost between Haifa and Tel Aviv. We've never had a suicide drone fly this far south out of Lebanese territory, so it's very significant. And also just consider Hezbollah, for example. Recently, 3 days ago, they shot a volley of 100 missiles from the Lebanese territory. And the outcome of that was, of course, Israeli bases hit, but only one Israeli soldier died, 13 were injured. So, in fact, despite the fact that Israel is trying to take out as many Hezbollah people as possible. Hezbollah is mostly aiming at equipment rather than actually Israeli personnel. So we see, in a way, it's almost carrying out a humanitarian type of warfare, almost trying to deter the Israelis, kind of convince them that they need to go for a peace agreement, between Palestine, Lebanon, and Israel proper, without going into further bloodshed. So it does seem like the humane side in this particular conflict is, of course, the side of the Lebanese people, the side of the Palestinians. And maybe this is just my personal bias speaking, but it does appear that way when Israel is really playing for keeps. It's fighting as if its existence is on the line, whereas Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Palestinians are really fighting for some sort of mutual agreement amongst themselves. And this kind of speaks volumes about where this conflict may even be taken in the future. And the other thing that really speaks to this, Conrad, is the fact that one of the Hamas officials, Musa Abu Marzouk, actually traveled to Moscow a few days ago at the same time as the BRICS summit was taking place in Kazan. And he spoke to Russian media. He met up with one of the Russian deputy foreign ministers, Mikhail Bogdanov, and he coordinated the release of two Hamas prisoners, Alex Trufanov and Maxim Herkin. These are two Russian nationals who were held prisoners by Hamas since the beginning, since October 7th, so more than a year now. And he stated that as a gesture to our Russian friends, Hamas is willing to release them and is willing to, in exchange for a ceasefire and a Palestinian prisoner release. Now, Russia has officially sent, a few days ago, after this visit of Marzouk to Moscow, has sent an official delegation to Israel in order to coordinate this Palestinian exchange. So it's quite interesting how Russia now, in order to protect some of its own, now these people, they are ethnically Russian, or maybe they're jointly Israeli, maybe they're Russian Jews, we're not too sure. Nevertheless, Russia seems to be fighting for its citizens here and willing to go into these peace talks between Palestine and Israel in order to try and work things out. So it's curious how, despite the fact that the entire Western world has deemed Hamas a terrorist organization, Russia is still willing to coordinate and speak to them on peaceful terms in order to actually save the lives of their own citizens, which speaks volumes about how Hamas is actually, somewhat willing to sit down at some of these cooperation tables and speak about, potential peace terms, even if they're temporary, which is really, I think, really interesting. And of course, we all recall Ismail Haniyeh's killing in Tehran, which was probably the biggest loss towards the peace party of the Palestinian side, because again, he was one of the biggest spokespersons for a peaceful agreement between the really militant side of the Palestinians and that of the Israeli side. And so since then, I think things have really gone downhill.
I very much agree. And you mentioned some of the big people that have been taken out in Hezbollah and Hamas leadership. Hamas, still fighting in North Gaza as well, in the refugee camps that are getting bombed, in these places where, there are still death squads of Zionist soldiers roaming. I don't know how many battalions are functioning. I don't know if they're even functioning at that organizational level anymore, but some form of armed resistance is functioning in most areas. Obviously, Yahya Sinwar, he was killed in Rafah, so there are still active forces there. We're talking about Gaza. I haven't heard a whole lot from Khan Yunis, but I assume there's at least something going on there. So while Hamas itself may not be as organized, they are still fighting. And again, as we've said, it's impossible to actually, quote unquote, fully defeat Hamas like Netanyahu has, always wanted, because it's a political insurgency that the more you kill the people in it, ultimately more people will join it among the population that you are occupying. So that's how that is obviously going to go down. But so there were some other Israeli strikes, of course. A commander of the Hezbollah's Ridwan force, which are some of the main forces in southern Lebanon, were killed in some pretty big strikes. This one was Abbas Adnan Muslim. So, they continue to, all forces, political, religious, on the ground, battalion commanders, they continue to get decapitated because Israeli intelligence penetration is very strong. And again, you got to remember, people listening to this are from America, from Russia, from Europe. These are very small places, Lebanon, Israel, the southern border region. It's not very big. These are New England sized countries. So imagine, the border between like Connecticut and New York, or like the border between, like New Hampshire and Vermont and these kinds of places. These are the sizes of the borders we're talking about. So there's only so many places to hide, which this is why the tunnel networks have become so important. And we've seen some very interesting videos of the size and, scale and complexity of some of these tunnels. And they are very impressive, to say the least. And there is a lot of footage, like the Israelis have had to call in a lot of airstrikes. I mean, I'm seeing airstrikes getting called in, huge airstrikes to kill 1-2 guys holed up in a little bunker, a little house. And that's because, the Israelis don't want to go in. These soldiers don't want to go in and actually face, hand-to-hand combat because, these Muslim guys, they're gonna fight to the death, obviously. And so these IDF soldiers aren't really, they're not really trying to do all of that. They want to handle this from a distance and occupy and do all of that. And, I'm still getting conflicting reports, and we'll post about it on the social media, how much local Christians are or are not, helping the Israelis. But that's something that politically we will see if they decide. Obviously, the Lebanese, the Phalangist party, they continue to try to use this war as an opportunity to totally defeat Hezbollah. Other Christians have spoken positively about Palestinians and their resistance and whatnot. So it's an interesting situation. But you mentioned the BRICS situation. Before we completely pivot to that, we got to mention Russia. This big rumor, this is from the Wall Street Journal. They're talking about how the Russians are supposedly providing geospatial intelligence to the Houthis. Then the Wall Street Journal report says the Houthis, which began their attacks last year over their Gaza war, eventually began using Russian satellite data as they expanded their strikes, said a person familiar with the matter and two European defense officials. The data was passed through members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps who were embedded with the Houthis in Yemen, one of the people said. So obviously Wall Street Journal biased, neocon type source, but it has something. It shows you that, again, we've talked about Russia leaning more into their relationship with Iran. That's public, them sending S-400s and all these other things and giving these stern warnings to Israel. Russia doesn't usually give warnings to Israel. If anything, behind the scenes, it feels like Israel probably gives warnings to Russia. But the Wall Street Journal report went on to say, in the Middle East, the Russian assistance underscores a tectonic shift in its strategy. Putin has strengthened ties with Iran while turning a cold shoulder to his long-standing relationship with Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which we kind of did comment on that a little bit in the previous episodes. So the Houthi situation there, they continue to go strong. Again, al-Houthi himself, I assume he's on some kind of kill list, but he has managed to evade, NATO, US, UK, French airstrikes and whatnot, and they continue to strike, and they continue to launch drones and ballistic missiles that hit Israel, that hit Eilat, that hit other parts of Israel even farther north than you would guess they would reach. So, again, congratulations to the Houthis for basically, I don't want to say winning, but they have withstood the full brunt of Zog and the United States naval regime that, with barely being a state actor, they're barely a state actor as much as Hezbollah is, you know what I mean? Like, they do control a capital, so they have a bit more legitimacy, but they are not recognized by anybody. So it's quite the development. But again, to pivot things to BRICS, and I want to hear what you think is the most interesting thing coming out of Kazan, Dimitri. We heard, this was one of the more interesting quotes, in my opinion, was that Putin said, "I hope Palestine will soon join the work and become a member and partner of BRICS," which obviously that's another explicit reification of their support for the two-state solution and the Palestinian statehood, and which of course would be the West Bank and Gaza, and returning to the 1967 borders and all of that kind of stuff, which is also supported by Saudi Arabia and all these other things. Which also, perhaps before we even talk about the BRICS summit, we also need to talk about the Saudi-Iranian joint drills in the Persian Gulf, which is definitely an interesting development, as Iran had warned the UAE, Saudi Arabia, all these countries to not allow Israel to use its airspace to retaliate, on Iran, which seems to happen. Most of the airstrikes seem to go over, Iraq and Jordan, and I don't think Iraq wanted those strikes to go over its airspace, but they weren't capable of doing anything about it. So that's how that went down. But while the U.S. is offering to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, like, we will protect you against Iranian strikes, like, do whatever you have to do. I don't know why they would even have to say that, because Iran and Saudi Arabia seem to be getting closer and closer, and it's being very much ignored in the Western media, because I think the U.S. does not like it, and it proves that there is a very real risk that, Saudi Arabia, while they definitely want to play both sides, they may become untethered from the U.S. yoke enough to where they don't actually do the U.S.'s bidding, to the point where Israel's strategic interests in the region will be very threatened. But if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it. Also, the thoughts on what's going on with the BRICS summit, because everybody was talking about the pictures of Putin with this dumb BRICS dollar bill thing, like new BRICS currency announced. Like, none of that was announced. And if you read a lot of the BRICS charter, it's all about, being cringe and gay and loving vaccines and doing all sorts of other stupid stuff. So again, the BRICS tards need to pump the brakes a little bit. And as usual in World War Now, we're for global orthodoxy. We're not for, a new version of Zog that calls itself multipolarity.
No, of course. The BRICS news is naturally the biggest story of this week, which is why everything else essentially orbits around it and why we make references to it, I think, throughout the entire episode. But in relation to Anthony Blinken's visit to Saudi Arabia, which took place at the same time as, of course, Mohammed bin Salman, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia is essentially like a BRICS plus partner. It's not necessarily a member of BRICS yet. It hasn't signed all of the paperwork. It hasn't essentially joined BRICS officially, but it is in some ways tied to BRICS still officially, although not being an official member. And what's interesting is Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, met with Anthony Blinken in the capital of Saudi Arabia. Very interesting. And this happened literally at the same time as the Saudi foreign minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, met with the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, while the Iranian president was in Kazan. And of course, what did the Iranian foreign minister speak to the Saudi foreign minister about? It was about these joint military naval drills in the Red Sea by both the Saudi Arabian kingdom as well as the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, this is just incredible. We see the biggest Sunni country, right? Well, you can say almost the most significant one of the most powerful Sunni countries. This, not being disrespectful to Turkey, because I think Turkey is somewhat of its own type of beast, and Iran cooperating for the first time. And again, naval drills, joint naval drills, that's very lightweight type exercises. Is not really. This isn't the same as the Korean agreement, the North Korean alignment of its military with Russia, which we'll speak about a bit later on. But still, this is a real opening towards a potential stability in the Middle East, which is probably why Saudi Arabia was one of the first countries as well to disavow the strikes of Israel against Iran when those took place. So it's really promising, I think, seeing these sort of diplomatic ties develop. And this is the first time I think the Iranian Navy since the revolution has done anything with Saudi Arabia. So this is quite big. It's somewhat disappointing that MBS did not travel to Kazan because it really would have made for possibly some massive discussions he could have had with, for example, the president of Ethiopia as well as the president of Egypt when we discussed those conflicts on the Horn of Africa and those frustrations which are growing there because the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has huge influence over the Sunni Muslim world, and yet he could potentially leverage that in order to bring stability. But his interests were he wanted to meet with Anthony Blinken more because I think we know that Anthony Blinken, that Ashkenazi spokesperson of the U.S. deep state, probably has a lot more influence than even the president of Egypt, if we really think about it, exactly how much power these people hold. But pivoting to BRICS a little bit, there were a lot of interesting things said. I think the biggest announcement made at BRICS was this essentially a creation of a BRICS bridge, which would be an alternative payment messaging system to SWIFT, which again, SWIFT was one of the payment systems which Russia was excluded from. It's a European-based payment system, an electronic form of fund transfer, which Russia was excluded from after the beginning of the SMO. And this was greatly supported by both China, India, and Iran, Iran being already a heavily sanctioned country. But also if we consider any potential interventions in the future by, say, India in Bangladesh, Indian actions against Pakistan in the future, or even Chinese actions in Myanmar or Taiwan could also lead to these countries also being sanctioned into a similar, really difficult position like Iran and Russia. And so these countries, of course, warmly welcome the idea of developing a BRICS bridge alternative to SWIFT in order for them to have more liberty in the future to actually conduct themselves in a sovereign fashion, with their geopolitical interests in mind. I think that's quite a big achievement, the fact that they actually spoke about this sort of alternative payment system. Naturally, this is Vladimir Putin's huge interest because, again, Russia, despite the fact that Russia has grown in terms of GDP over the last 2 years, there are a lot of industries in Russia which are suffering from these sanctions. So Russia is very, very interested in actually developing alternative forms of, money transfers and being related, being interacting and involving itself in international markets. So again, money really makes the world go round, unfortunately, in this 21st century. But Vladimir Putin said something very interesting, which kind of goes against his general messaging. And I'm going to quote him here. He says, "We are not rejecting or fighting the dollar, but if we are not given the chance to use it, what can we do? We are forced to look for other alternatives." Against this sort of nuanced position, right, Conrad? It's like, oh, well, we're not really fighting against the so-called Satanists, the so-called globalists, but we're kind of forced to work against them, right? We're not really fighting against the neo-Nazis, which that word was not even used, despite the fact that Ukraine was a massive talking point, at least during Vladimir Putin's press conference at this BRICS summit in Kazan. He spoke very heavily about the fact that Russia itself will handle the Ukrainian issue. This is not something that other BRICS countries need to assist Russia in sort of conducting. This is a Russian-only problem. And that's quite interesting. It's almost taking accountability for the entire operation. And naturally, I think we probably can agree that these other nations are really not interested in assisting Russia in the sort of liberation of Malorussia, Novorossiya, and the Saturnization, the Zionification of Ukraine. I think these countries are very much, they all have their own interests at heart, and they all have bilateral relations strongly with the United States, right? We have to not forget that Russia, Iran, these two major BRICS countries, Iran being a new member, they're very much disconnected from the US now, whilst China, India, countries like Brazil and South Africa, Brazil specifically, Conrad, has very, very close ties to America. In fact, it's probably the closest nation to America. And this is why the president of Brazil, Lula, actually didn't travel to Kazan in Russia. In fact, allegedly, he fell over and he hit his head. So a physical injury prevented him from making and joining into this massive photo ops, which we saw, of course, with the Prime Minister of India, Xi Jinping, as well as Putin. I think the photos were more powerful than the messaging, perhaps even. Despite this BRICS bridge announcement and the fact that, the bilateral sitting down at a conferencing table of the Indian and the Chinese delegation, which was also quite big, I think there weren't really that many exciting or even, I would say, significant announcements, right? Perhaps, again, hypothetically, there would have been discussions between the Egyptian delegation and the Ethiopian delegation, right? We would hope that they would use this opportunity in order to resolve certain issues in the Horn of Africa. But again, officially, there's been no statements made. So these are possibly discussions at this BRICS forum, which took place behind closed doors. Again, what exactly this would mean for the future of India and China, I think we can kind of speculate, but perhaps it could involve Arunachal Pradesh. Some of those, I know, Conrad, you know a lot more about this than me, the stick fighting that happens on the Indian-Chinese border, right? Where the actual border guards don't carry firearms. They in fact guard the borders with like baseball bats and literally sticks taken from ancient trees which grow in the Himalayas and the Tibet Mountains. I mean, it's a little bit Sheldon-esque, but I think that's just part of the culture over there. But that may end very soon because India and China seem to be rectifying their relationships. And I think generally speaking, that BRICS dollar or that BRICS currency, that paper, design that Putin did show to the BRICS members, I think it's good having that project in mind for the future as an alternative. But again, until the US financial system really does crash, all these countries are very heavily invested in, of course, having US dollar reserve. All these countries use the US dollar. The US dollar, we have to understand, this new fiat system is a replacement for gold. Gold is no longer valuable in the world economy. The US dollar is. As strange as that may seem, this is how twisted world economics has become. When our BRICS 8th Hour episode is released on YouTube and everyone will get to see it and watch it, which I recommend, I think it'll be released in the next 5 to 7 days, we'll have a more or less in-depth discussion of exactly what the US dollar is and what role it plays in this sort of BRICS version of economics. But Conrad, I think generally speaking, this BRICS summit, it wasn't the most exciting thing, unfortunately, that took place, despite all the hype that went into it throughout this entire year.
No, I agree. And I think, as usual, people are posting things like, BRICS just announced a new gold-backed replacement to the dollar. And obviously that is just not happening. And that's, even Modi, he was casting aspersions on BRICS, even being viewed as anti-Western at all. These kinds of things. You mentioned the India-China thing. The announcement was that in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, the two regions that have the line of demarcation disputed between China and India, the two countries agreed to have joint patrols, which should, in theory, bring an end to the stick battles, which, is a real tragedy to, geography, border anomaly, skirmish nerds like myself. So a real tragedy in the diplomacy world. But yeah, again, the most interesting things to come out of the BRICS situation, as you mentioned, there's 3 countries that were rejected, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Turkey. And we saw that, 2 of those countries were rejected by Brazil, which a lot of people have talked about how Lula, people like, Haas and Jackson Hinkle and others that are very pro-BRICS, they see Lula, they're like, yeah, he was against Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was a U.S. puppet and everything. But Lula, the NED and the CIA NGOs that operate in Brazil, they operated for Lula against Bolsonaro. And even though Bolsonaro, ended up fleeing to the United States, and it seemed that he was in asylum there and was supported, because Trump ostensibly did support him. No, the Lula was put in to be sort of a poison pill. People thought he was this multipolar guy. He's like a socialist, all this stuff. But no, he vetoed Venezuela and Nicaragua from BRICS. And, I'm not a huge fan of Venezuela or Nicaragua. Nicaragua, they persecuting pretty openly the Catholic Church. And in Venezuela, they can't even really properly keep the country together. But it's clear that, Brazil is operating, more in the interest of the US. And then Turkey was vetoed because India hates Pakistan so much, which is interesting, which again, like that could, be relevant down the road because of, the Russia-Turkey thing. And, we know that, talking about the airspace issue with Israel launching airstrikes, obviously when Erdogan falls, I think the future Kemalist government will be much more willing to allow Israel to strike Iran through Turkish airspace. Obviously, Azerbaijani airspace is open for the taking for Israel whenever they want it. So that would be something that could, the real strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities, as the prophecies say, Erdogan may have to fall for that to become real. And it seems that, Erdogan may not be able to get into BRICS either. And, any Kemalist government obviously isn't going to want to join BRICS either. So it seems that we were sort of reaching the peak and the zenith of Russo-Turkish relations. We may bring that up a little bit more when we talk about what's going on in Syria. But yeah, I think the BRICS situation is, BRICS isn't going to save us from, the West and all these things. And obviously the Ukrainians were all mad at Gutierrez, the, UN Secretary General showing up at the BRICS summit. Everybody was really angry about that. And, there were pictures with Modi and Xi taken together after they had agreed with the joint border patrols and everything. So it was a interesting diplomatic episode, but, nothing, like, some of these multipolarista people might want to extrapolate. A lot of that stuff did not exactly go down. But obviously we got to talk about the situation in Georgia. But I guess, I did bring up Syria. There are these big strikes going on. Russia is striking a lot of places all over the place, 10 people dead in a lot of these different strikes, individually. So a lot of death count adding up. And it seems that, again, the proxies between the US proxies and those Turkish proxies that kind of split up from each other and were clashing, Russia has struck both of them. And it does seem, though, that the US proxies are taking losses now. More of the forces coalesced around the Turkish-backed forces. And as far as I can tell from analysis, it's really hard to parse all the different factions when you're reading the different reports. But it seems that the Russian forces are more willing to work with the Turkish proxies to clear out the last remnants of the US proxies. And there were even reports that Russian troops and Turkish border patrols were doing joint patrols in some of these regions. This is in Idlib in Syria, by the way. And the situation in Syria is confusing because obviously Israel strikes regularly. We remember earlier in last episode that Israel struck near the Russian airbase, near Damascus. So it's a very tense situation with the Russian presence there. And the real question you start to ask, like, will the Turkish proxies and the Russian forces begin to more overtly clash? Maybe after the US proxies are fully driven out, will that become more overt? And, we saw even Turkish border guards on the Turkish side of the border were firing on, the US-backed proxies that were fighting against them. It was the Levant forces versus the joint forces, where they're, these kind of coalition names that were going back and forth. And I think, again, if Russia and Turkey are to, it seems that Putin and Erdogan both want to work together in the region. It seems that, geopolitical circumstances are pitting them against each other in multiple conflicts. The moment that a less sympathetic president is installed in Turkey, that, Russia and Turkey may, at a certain level, automatically be at war. So that's very interesting. And I think the reports in Syria that, again, I have no, verification on some of these sources, but there is some indication that Syria is trying to distance itself from Iran, because I don't know if that's just because they're sick of taking it so hard from Israel. I don't know if they are trying to focus on the Turkish front or something. But again, there was reports that, Syrian forces were actually, going after certain IRGC forces. Again, I don't have any verification on that, but there may be some trouble in paradise behind the scenes there. But again, before we talk about Georgia, I know it's the ongoing situation. There was also the attack on Turkey in Ankara, which Erdogan actually had to leave the BRICS summit early to go and address the situation there. It was some Kurdish nonsense, and Turkey has been dramatically increasing its strikes in Iraq and Syria on the Turkish forces, on PKK and other Turkish-aligned forces there. So, Dimitri, unless you have any comments on the kind of broad Turkey front in Syria and Iraq, both against, Assad and U.S. proxies, as well as Kurdish forces, which again, we know the Kurds are also a U.S. proxy. So, Russia, Turkey, and U.S. proxies, it's very much a three-way war going on in what I guess the Kurds would call Kurdistan, because all of these, the Kurds live in all of these regions that we're talking about here.
No, absolutely. I think the 2024, the Turkish aerospace base attack, which took place during the BRICS summit. Erdogan had to leave early to sort of address the risks. We know Erdogan as a leader is very hands-on. If you recall the 2016 coup that took place in Ankara and across Turkey, Erdogan actually did not run off into a bunker. He remained literally at the work desk and sort of worked to resolve the coup. He's a very brave man, actually. And, despite the fact that we praise Erdogan so much, we do understand his sort of role and place in the future of Turkey. And this, Conrad, I couldn't help but just cringe at the fact that these people, it's similar to the Donald Trump episode on Joe Rogan during the podcast where he literally says, well, there are these, prophecies about the Middle East where, the end of times will come. And I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but it seems that these people are literally working towards bringing the end of the world closer and closer, including this alienation of Turkey by India. I think it's almost purposeful. It's like, wait a minute, why are we seeking to move Turkey further away from us into, again, the embrace of the EU and NATO further when Turkey seems to want to work towards its own independence in this, future multipolar world? I think that was a huge misstep by India, a huge misplay. And in the end, it may actually be one of those, again, these dominoes that falls towards this greater war between Greece, I think the EU, NATO, and Russia. And again, on Turkish soil, the reestablishment of the Hagia Sophia, and of course the death of probably thousands of people in this coming conflict. I think, this sort of next step of the world war, it's quite horrific when you see something like that take place. I think it's really scary as well. Literally, the world moves towards what these prophecies foretold before our very eyes, and literally through the works of a Hindu prime minister, which is quite amusing. But this terrorist strike on the 23rd of October, actually, it took place in Ankara. It was essentially these two Marxist, socialist, PKK, this is the Kurdistan Workers' Party personnel. Essentially, this was a Turkish airbase, which it wasn't really an airbase. It was more like a training facility. It was where Turkish drones were made, different sort of technology was designed. There was a lot of students there as well, young people. They ended up assaulting it with really compact AK-74 SUs, which were very compact AK assault rifles with silencers on them. These two socialist terrorists of Kurdish background, they were well known to the Turks as well. And they just entered this facility. They killed 5 people, injured 22. Both of them ended up being killed themselves. They were also armed with explosives and grenades, and they planned out ahead of time the mapping of this facility. So they set up the explosives in really key locations, and they knew where all the exits were. Again, similar to Crocus City Hall, this was a planned sort of operation. By the way, on that Crocus City Hall note, we received an update. It's been almost 7 months since that event. In late March, just before Purim, the head of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, actually stated officially that the Crocus City Hall Tajik Persian terrorists were actually working for not Ukraine, not the CIA, but ISIS Khorasan, which again is that eastern wing of ISIS, this is the same story that the West was telling us at the beginning of that Crocus City Hall terror act. And yet we saw the Russian Federation push the narrative that, it was clearly Ukraine funded. They were even driving the car from Moscow, from the Crocus City Hall to the Ukrainian border. Clearly, this was the Khahols, this was the Bandera terrorists, right? These were, the Tajik neo-Nazis. Turns out it was ISIS Khorasan now, according to the head of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov. Very curious conclusions and no sort of indication that this might have been a deeper Talmudic operation with the assistance of the oligarch who owned the particular center. Again, it seems that all these clues are being tidied up and packaged very neatly into, it's just Islamist terrorists. What can you do? They sort of break into the country and then they cause these events. But in this particular PKK terrorist strike, Conrad, what we saw was Turkey instantly, Erdogan came back from Kazan to Ankara, and Turkey retaliated with very broad strikes on 40 targets all over northeastern Syria, targets which they knew belonged to the Kurds. They killed, I think, several tens of people. Again, it's not announced. Turkey officially announced that they did not kill a single civilian, but allegedly at least 12 civilians have been killed belonging to, these are citizens of Syria who were formerly citizens of the Assad family and, the Syrian people. So again, it's just concerning. Turkey's reaction seems to be very, very aggressive towards these minorities. But the most curious thing is, again, notice how, again, these socialist Marxist terrorists, we know who they're supported by. These are US, Israel aligned. The Kurds are very interesting because the Kurds are very curious. They're Muslims, but at the same time, they're aligned with these Marxist beliefs, which we know come from Karl Marx. These are all very Talmudic ideas, which again, perpetrated so many horrors all over Eastern Europe over the last century, in the 20th century. And they're, of course, supported by people like Jackson Hinkle, MAGA communists, etc., very strongly Zionist, Israel aligned. Israel actually speaks openly in support of the Kurds, in support of giving the Kurds a Kurdish state in Syria against the Assad regime, which is very hypocritical given that the Palestinians don't really have their own independent state in Israel, then Israel rejects the two-state solution. So the entire Kurdish question is one which is very deeply geopolitical. It's not just, oh, there is a minority which is being oppressed. It's that the minority itself is being used by very dark forces, Marxist forces, Zionist forces, and even, I think, well, you can see where the sort of spiritual background comes if they're committing terror strikes against literally civilians and students working out an aerospace center, which, is kind of military aligned, but at the same time, it's not really a military base of sorts. So just really concerning, the PKK and the entire Free Kurdistan movement is very dark. And I think in the end, this will probably move Turkey to a more radical stance on what's happening in Syria, Conrad. I think in the future, most of the anti-Syrian strikes by Turkey are coming from the perspective that the Kurds commit these terror strikes. Therefore, we need to radically intervene in Syria and sort of perpetrate our geopolitical interests and push them and implement our interests onto the territory of another state, which is exactly the excuse that Israel is using in Lebanon when it fights against Hezbollah. So all these nations use almost the same talking points.
No, I agree. And as I mentioned before, there are reports that Russian strikes and, Russian warplanes have directly hit Ansar al-Tawhid, which is one of these paramilitary groups in northern Syria in the Idlib region, and they are directly funded by Turkey. So that all really is going on. And you talked about sort of the general situation in Turkey with the Kurds, and we know that that is kind of the motivating political situation among the Turks. And we know that there are prophecies about not just Armenia getting bigger and there being an Armenian state. Some of the prophecies do talk about there being a Kurdish state, and I have no idea how that's going to happen, if that's another thing that the Kemalists will balk on. But again, it does seem that Erdogan's fall will be a big shakeup, especially, of course, for the immediate neighbors to Turkey, obviously Greece being the main one, and then Syria, Lebanon, and then Russia being sort of the main one that doesn't share a direct border with Turkey, but shares, a big maritime border on the Black Sea. Russia will be dramatically impacted by the passing of Erdogan, specifically in Syria, where they are directly clashing with these proxies, and they have their, Syrian sea base that they need, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, open to reach ports in the Black Sea on the Russian coast, in Sevastopol and these other places that they have worked so hard in these wars with Ukraine against NATO to secure. And so all this geostrategic positioning starts to come together when Erdogan goes, and all of the, the chess pieces that people have set up, that all becomes relevant. And the bases that people have built on the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean and on the Black Sea and in the North Sea and all these places, that's everybody, puts all their cards on the table and uses the capital that they've amassed for themselves in a big war. And Russia is trying to make sure that they are positioned properly. Turkey is trying to make sure that it's positioned properly. Obviously, the fact that even de facto Kurdistan exists is not something that Turkey wants to accept. And they still seem to have a lot of issues with Assad, which is why they're trying to create this big buffer zone into Syria as well as Iraq, which again, Iraq is even more lawless than Syria, as there really is no Assad figure for people that support the Iraqi national project to rally around. But Erdogan's death isn't going to be the only thing that's coming down the pipe. We're hearing a lot of reports that, the crown, the king of Saudi Arabia is on his last legs. And sure, Mohammed bin Salman has already been effectively ruling the country, but that's going to be a big deal as well. So Erdogan and the king of Saudi Arabia, I think their demise is on the horizon. So we're going to see some big shakeups. Of course, Raisi's death, and I don't know if we're ever going to get a new Ayatollah anytime soon. I don't know if Netanyahu's going to get out, but, those things are all on the horizon. And perhaps, maybe God has some of those people's falls. I mean, Erdogan and the king of Saudi Arabia, maybe that's going to happen more, sooner after this big election that we have coming up, sooner after that than we might think. We really are in, a season of change, and a lot of the things in these conflicts, Ukraine, Iran, a lot of things are kind of waiting on edge for this election to get decided, despite the fact that I'm not sure how many of the behind the scenes characters in the Pentagon, at the DOD, in the State Department are actually going to change when it's all said and done at this election. But it's going down for real. And the whole region, the whole Islamic world is about to be reckoned with. And it's And, Russia, the US, Israel, these are China as well. We know that China is going to be reacting when all this goes down, and the Persian Gulf oil is, everybody needs it. And we know that if Saudi Arabia and Iran are more on the same page, then, maybe a few months down the line, Iran is more willing to escalate against Israel because they know that Saudi Arabia isn't going to act as a, staging front for the US and Israel to wage war against them. So, like I said, the stage is being set. World War III is underway. And when the big thing, it wasn't until the 40s when, it wasn't until years later when the U.S. fully entered the Eastern Front. The Pacific Front had to be underway. And then eventually we, entered on D-Day and everything. That's what's happening right now. All of the, the smaller players, the regional players are fighting it out, and people are losing and people are winning. And then, eventually the big boys are going to come in, and that's when things are going to get decided. But with all of that, we do have to move to, something that's not, people might see, what does this have to do with World War III? But, the situation in Georgia, that's a big southern front for Russia. And right now, we're seeing a bit of a, 2020 situation. Everybody is claiming that they won, results are being contested. I'm going to read from CIG, a trusted source. The preliminary data says the Georgian Dream Party is winning. They will have 88 out of 150 MPs. That's what, again, preliminary data is saying right now. You need 76 for a majority with that count. So there would be 62 MPs from the pro-EU opposition. And again, this whole election, it's, somewhat confusing and everything. But again, it's the ruling Georgian Dream Party who have been ruling since 2012. They are ostensibly viewed as pro-Russian. They are controlled by Bidzina Ivanishvili, who is, the Georgian oligarch that people claim controls all of Georgia. And he's, conservative and orthodox and these kinds of things. Of course, the main leader of the party politically is Irakli Kobakidze, who's the, the prime minister of Georgia and is the main political leader. They come in opposition to, of course, everybody hears the reports about Salom Zurabishvili, who is the president of Georgia, who is, independent, but aligns herself with all of the pro-Western parties and everything. And she is trying to always veto the anti-foreign agent and the anti-LGBT laws that the ruling party is putting forward. So this election is, the Georgian Dream Party against this coalition of like four parties, called the Unity, this big coalition of the Unity National Movement, Strong Georgia, and Coalition for Change parties that are all pro-EU, pro-LGBT, anti-Russia. They want to fight a war against Russia to reclaim sovereignty over Abkhazia and South Ossetia. They want to, completely reduce Russian influence. They want to reduce the influence of the church and increase the influence of liberal NGOs. They want to join the European Union. They want to enter into all these other alliances and, again, become a staging front in a whole southern flank that Russia has to defend. And eventually they just want to invade. I mean, the Georgian Dream Party has said they know that the Western powers that influence these elections in Georgia want to turn Georgia into another Ukraine. They want to distract Russia and use it as a way to disrupt Russia and, provoke them from their southern flank. So that's what's going on. And it does seem that the Georgian Dream Party is going to come out on top, but all the opposition and the president and all these people are saying that this is unacceptable and their celebrations, their early celebrations are, not allowed and all this stuff is bad and that we're going to contest this. And so there may be a color revolution brewing. By the time you're listening to this recording, there may be violence in the streets. We know that there's definitely going to be protests, and we'll see if, the powers that be in the West and the EU can succeed in prying Georgia away from the Russian sphere, which it seems to have finally re-entered after a dormant slumber. But I'm wondering your thoughts on the Georgia situation, Dimitri. I know that we've been happily commenting on Georgia's drift back towards its actual regional, influence in the Russo sphere and the Orthodox sphere, but, it seems that there is a concerted effort to fix that, as it were.
No, absolutely. And who knows, maybe this week it'll be announced that the new prime minister of Georgia will be Irakli Kabachidze, which, again, the name Heraclius, essentially, this is reminiscent of the early 7th century Byzantine Roman emperor who fought against the Zoroastrian Persians and essentially saved that entire region and those Christians from Persian domination. So this is why Georgians even today call their children Irakli or Heraclius. The name is so popular, going back to that early Roman emperor who I think is probably one of the coolest Byzantine Roman rulers, who will definitely have an episode about with Gregory Hears, I think, in the future, probably in 2025. But this Georgian Dream victory or hypothetical victory that will take place, I think it's a massive move. You can just imagine how difficult it is being a pro-Russian Georgian MP when The Russian Federation officially controls 20% of Georgian territory, sort of not really constitutionally from a Georgian perspective, illegally. This is, of course, Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, which, again, if you think from a Ukrainian perspective, it's as if Zelensky could somehow win an election by being pro-Russian, despite the fact that Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, and portions of Kherson and Zaporozhye were under the control of Russia. It's completely unimaginable. So what Georgian Dream Party is doing here is completely unprecedented, and it's incredible. It really shows that the Orthodox Christian perspective of the Georgian people matters more than some of these geopolitical machinations really pushed on by the West. And the reason why I say machinations is because we see pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western spokespersons, NGOs, all kinds of really weird people hanging out in Tbilisi at the moment, the capital of Georgia. They're posting online that, essentially provoking Maidans, provoking riots, claiming that this election was fraudulent. There's bizarre clips coming out that people are trying to essentially disassociate the Georgian dream from a legitimate victory in this particular election in Georgia. Essentially, I completely agree with some of the Georgian dream spokespersons that there is a Maidan in the making in Georgia. I don't think the West will that easily allow its sort of control over Georgia to cease. I think there'll most likely be a fight, which is why all these bizarre NGOs, spokespersons, journalists from the West, and especially from Ukraine, which is really the sort of harbor and the homeland of all these sort of anti-Russian spokespersons, why they're spending time in Georgia at the moment, kind of stirring this pot just south of the Russian border in the Caucasus. And, Georgia is not the biggest country, but in terms of significance and just influence over, I guess, the Orthodox Christian consensus, it's quite important. 3.7 million people. It's, just a third of the size of Belarus, but still, in terms of its geopolitical significance and importance in the Southern Caucasus, especially when we discuss the countries of Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, we understand that position is key. And their relationship to Russia, I think, going forward, will be huge. And I think, who knows, in the future, if Georgia ever really aligns itself with the Orthodox geopolitical position with the Russian Federation, and if the Russian Federation at the same time, essentially rejuvenates itself, becomes potentially, when Russia does inevitably, Conrad, transition into a monarchy, who knows, perhaps Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia will again rejoin with Georgia, and Georgia will even join up with Russia in a sort of allied state, joint nation, for example, similar to what we have with Belarus and the Russian Federation today. So the future looks very bright if the Georgian dream really does truly win. And again, we'll be looking out for some of those protests and posting about them, as they sort of occur and as they take place on the World War Now Telegrams. Definitely follow us there for daily updates. But I think the other interesting election that took place on the fringes of the former Russian imperial world were, of course, the referendum in Moldova. And this was not really an election, it was an official referendum in order for Moldova to officially make changes and edits to its constitution to formally commit to join the European Union. This was huge. Of course, Moldova, unlike Turkey, well, Turkey partially is in Europe. Of course, we know that on one side of the Bosphorus, but Moldova is very strongly in Europe. Moldova has wanted to join NATO as well for a while. It cannot join NATO, legally speaking, because Transnistria, Pridnestrovia is officially an independent state. So until no nation in Europe can join NATO until they resolve any sort of territorial disputes on their lands, which means that Moldova is, of course, barred from joining NATO, which I think is a real godsend and a blessing. But unfortunately,
well, that didn't stop Cyprus.
True, very interestingly. And I think that's mostly because Turkey was already a member of NATO. So probably it was officially almost sanctioned that Cyprus is a divided state, I think, in the eyes of NATO, unfortunately. So they break their own rules, of course. The hypocrisy, I think, is overwhelming. But this Moldovan referendum was really curious because if you think about it, statistically, Moldova is a country of 2.6 million people. 1.4 million of those 2.6 live actually outside of Moldova. So a lot of the people voting at this referendum were actually essentially mail-in votes coming from Europe, from Russia, from Romania, next door nations, from overseas, essentially, from all around the world. And still the yes vote on essentially Moldova joining itself to the EU won by a very, very slim margin. We're talking the yes vote won by 50.46%, so literally half a percentage point. And unfortunately, there's been some reports from Russian media sources, Russian patriots have been posting about it, that unfortunately this is probably because there weren't enough voting booths actually set up in the Russian Federation for Russian Moldovans to vote in this referendum. So they only had two opportunities. I think there was one voting booth in Moscow for the entire city and one voting booth set up in St. Petersburg. So Moldovans living in Russia really had no opportunity to vote against this EU vote. So that was quite a mistake if this report is true. So I think we'll see Maya Sandu and her government in Moldova really moving themselves close towards the West. But that doesn't really faze us, I think, Conrad, because again, a country can be economically aligned with the West, with the EU. We see that in countries like Serbia, who simply has to trade with its neighbors, where most of its neighbors are NATO countries, essentially all of its neighbors. And still, like geopolitically, it can be still moving itself strongly in an alignment with Russia. So I think it's possible to kind of double dip if you're a country such as Moldova. And in the future, who knows what Moldova's fate eventually will be, especially as we're moving into like a hot phase of World War III. Will Moldova and its sovereignty be compromised? Will Moldova join Romania? Will Moldova join, again, the future Russian state, which will again expand once this Ukrainian situation is resolved? Because people always speak about the Transnistria, Pridnestrovia example. And we recall that Moldova has its own issue in the southeastern lands, right? The Gagauzia, these are the essentially a Turkic minority. So these are ethnically non-Romanian people, non-Slavic at all. These are immigrants who migrated to this land long ago, and they're majority Orthodox Christians. So they are our Central Asian brothers living in this land. And what's interesting is they're very anti-Western. So there's a very small minority, obviously less than 1 million people, a few 100,000 Turkic Orthodox Christians living in Moldova who voted, I think they voted 95% against this EU joining. So that's quite curious. So in the future, there might be a Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea type situation in Moldova if Moldova is ever partitioned, and Gagauzia, of course, coming under this protectorate of the greater Russia when the Russian Federation, of course, rejuvenates itself. Especially we know that like Gagauzia essentially borders with the Oblast of Odessa, and we know how key Odessa is in this entire Ukrainian conflict situation. We spoke about the hypothetical Odessa campaign that the Russians may wage in the future as the Russo-Ukrainian war develops. So all very interesting, both of these, both the referendum and the election in Georgia, I think are key as the world kind of divides itself amongst these various axes and the sort of clash of civilizations develops further, unfortunately, inevitably. So as we kind of discuss, I think the India rejecting Turkey out of BRICS, I think was literally the best example of what we speak about on the show taking place. Literally, despite the fact that people want to work together, still our differences really force conflict into the greater picture of international relations and world affairs. It's really quite sad, but this is the sinful human condition, is it not?
Yeah, the situation in Moldova is unfortunate. Hopefully we get what we want out of the one in Georgia so that we can at least be, it'll be a wash for the weekend, as they say, win some, you lose some. But the situation with Moldova, another example of the diasporoids totally ruining it for people trying to, make something based happen in the old country. They send in their votes from overseas and are all in favor of being gay, joining the EU and everything like that. But you had Maya Sandu immediately coming out and saying that there was Russian involvement and they bought 300,000 votes, which again, in a country like Moldova, 300,000 votes, that makes all the difference. The election was only decided by, what was it, like 16,500 votes? That's how much the election was decided by. So 300,000 votes, that's an enormous number to claim. So obviously she's just talking absolute nonsense. I'm pretty sure the amount of people, you can just see it's clearly the only actual districts that are voting in majority for this vote are the ones around Chisinau that are, closer to the border with Romania, everything around that, including the border with Romania, but everything bordering Ukraine, anything close to Pridnestrovia, it's all completely voting, obviously, against the EU in this referendum. So no surprises there. But yeah, as we move away from these elections, we got to talk about the situation at hand in Ukraine, which again is always ongoing. We know that the rumors have been spreading more and more about the North Korean troops that are supposedly there. There's rumors anywhere 12,000. Some people are saying 30,000 now. People are really upping the numbers. South Korean intelligence, U.S. intelligence are really, really confirming this. So there's at least something to it. And whether it's just a bunch of troops training on the Russian-North Korean border in Siberia, whether this is troops in the SMO zone in some capacity on the back end of things, whether these are engineers, or if we really are going to see North Korean troops in the trenches, if we're going to get footage of Ukrainians or mercenaries encountering these guys, this is all going to be very interesting to see. And of course, the big news that kind of coincides with this is it was announced that Russia and North Korea have signed a mutual defense agreement, so a sort of NATO Article 5-esque contract was signed between these two countries, which again, if that's true, that would, as far as I'm aware, would that not necessitate immediate North Korean deployment to the SMO zone, at the very least in the Kursk region, if not also in the Donbass, because Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson are the full territory of those oblasts are Russian territory. So all those Ukrainian troops along the front line in those oblasts are invading troops within the Russian territory. So the North Korean government and the military would be obligated to jump into action to defend their new, ally, as the treaty would lay out. So this is all a very interesting development, Dmitry. I would love to hear your updates from the front line in Ukraine and what is really going on with these North Korean troops.
No, that's right. I think recently, at first these reports came from the Ukrainian media sources, again, the Ukrainian intelligence agencies, and, apparently, of course, fed from the CIA, from South Korean intelligence, but now it's almost been confirmed. And in fact, it has been 100% confirmed. And this security agreement, of course, signed on the 24th and 25th of October between Russia and the North Korean people. Again, it cements this relationship. And now, instead of Article 5, it'll be Article 4, which is the mutual defense sort of agreement between the countries. In fact, if one country's sovereignty is at risk, if its lands are invaded, then the other nation may again assist and even has an obligation to assist. So in this case, North Korea, as we know at the moment, is territorially stable. But the one country which, of course, has issues in its own borderlands is, of course, Russia, which is why, as you said, we most likely will see, and according to South Korean national intelligence, 3,000 troops are now, the North Korean troops are now located in not just Eastern Russia, but Western Russia, most likely moving towards Kursk. So if we hear within the next week or two of North Koreans actually fighting on Russian SMO zone territory, or even in the lands of the Kursk Oblast against the Ukrainians, we shouldn't really be surprised. Again, we spoke about the benefits, the pros and the cons last week about this, but generally speaking, this is one of the big moves. I think Russia may have the only agreement of this sort, the only security agreement with North Korea, I think, besides, I think even the Chinese People's Republic does not have an agreement of this level of cooperation. And this, again, could look, theologically speaking, in the future, again, this may lead to these North Koreans seeing Orthodox churches for the first time, going to services, seeing Russian Orthodox Christian chaplains at work as well. Maybe some of them will even be interested in Orthodox Christianity and could be baptized, right? Literally in the fields of battle, in the trenches. Who knows what kind of benefits this may bring to the North Korean people? It's similar to the Byzantine Romans, right? The Orthodox Romans using Varangians and other Slavic guardsmen in their sort of militaries before, of course, the baptism of Rus. A lot of those guards naturally, of course, took on Orthodox Christianity, which is why we read that even in Sviatoslav, who was a pagan Russian Grand Prince of Kiev, even in his army, he already had Orthodox Christian warriors and knights who fought against the Khazarian Khaganate. So they were, in fact, warriors of Rus who were already being baptized by the Orthodox Greeks and the Orthodox Romans before the official baptism of Russia by Saint Vladimir. So that's quite interesting. We could see an analogy here. Maybe I'm being too hopeful, but I think we need to have a Christian outlook, and we need to look at sort of the optimistic outcomes of this particular cooperation between the two countries. So, and Russia, of course, this security agreement is going to go a very long way. South Korea threatened to send more resources and personnel, potentially even South Korean military officials to Ukraine. But we already know South Korea has provided logistical support as well as financial aid to Ukraine. So South Korea has already signed under the dotted line that it will support Ukraine in the conflict. So North Korea doing likewise for the Russian Federation should not be surprising. Again, hypocrisy needs to be set aside by some of these pro-Western regimes because, again, they've all been supporting Ukraine for the last 2.5 years. And naturally, some nations wish to support Russia, such as Iran and North Korea, very openly. So Kim Jong-un, of course, benefits from this. How Trump's presidency will impact this, given that Trump, especially on the recent Joe Rogan episode, spoke very fondly of Kim Jong-un and how he has a personal relationship. How this will impact the Russian-North Korean relationship, we're not too sure, but it may make for some very interesting video footage if Trump visits North Korea once again. Who knows where this will go? But officially, yes, it's confirmed North Korean troops are training at the moment, equipping themselves, preparing to participate in the SMO. It's not just military exercises, I believe, although no troops have yet been confirmed to fight against the Ukrainians on the front lines. So that's kind of where we stand at the moment. A very interesting development, I think, going forward.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of other news necessarily on the front lines in Ukraine. Russia is making fairly substantial advances, specifically in Donetsk, as well as, of course, in near Luhansk border as well, and in Kursk. Obviously, Kursk is very soon going to be totally under Russian control again. But, there is a rumor that Ukraine had made some gains in Zaporozhye, but that Russia is planning a fairly large counteroffensive there as well as they continue to basically dismantle all of the operations that maintain the Donetsk front line and just the general old Donbass front line that had been maintained since 2014. That is being slowly dismantled as Russia takes a lot of these towns with, again, the towns aren't huge, but the roads they control are relevant. They have these big depots. A lot of them have been built up as these citadels that were very relevant to the rail and the truck transport of the logistics behind the scenes. So all of that is coming to a close. Zelensky's getting anxious. Putin, of course, in his talk at the BRICS situation made a talk about how, we're ready to come to the table, but at the same time, we can let the situation on the ground work itself out. We're not nervous. He really reiterated that they're going to handle it themselves and all this kind of stuff. So I don't know if that was kind of overcompensating for the situation with the North Korean troops getting leaked or anything, but clearly, if anybody's going to be getting involved, it will be the North Koreans, but the Russians aren't trying to get any other like CSTO members or anything like that involved as much as obviously NATO, obviously no one else is directly involved overtly, but the amount of foreign troops and the mercenaries in Ukraine, as well as the fact that Sweden and NATO joined the Baltic states in becoming border states with Russia that are now within NATO, which is a very inadvertent form of, just planting some troops just right there on your northern border who can do whatever they need to do at any given time. But yeah, the situation in Ukraine, we're going to be talking a bit about some church stuff there. But before we talk about church stuff, we do have to talk about Africa. And we've been talking a lot about the Ethiopia-Somalia situation, about Ethiopia, recognizing Somaliland, getting access to the sea, Ethiopia being then ganged up on by this alliance of, Egypt, Somalia, Sudan, ostensibly, which, again, not the Rapid Support Forces, but who are supported by the UAE, but, many other countries, joining forces with Somalia to, be in favor of their territorial integrity. Generally, the Arab League and most Muslim countries were siding with Somalia. But then now we were wondering, what's Ethiopia going to do? Eritrea was even ganging up against them because they are, of course, historic enemies. But now it seems that, and I had, I believe I might have predicted this at one point, but it does seem that it is developing that I'm going to read this from Africa Intel. Israel-Somaliland military deal to spark diplomatic tensions with Somalia. So it appears Ethiopia may be finding an ally in Israel against all of its Muslim neighbors that are ganging up against it. I'm going to read the rest of this article. Israel's plan to establish a military base in Somaliland is likely to heighten diplomatic tensions between Somalia and the Middle Eastern state. According to the Qatari state-funded media Middle East Monitor, Israel is eyeing a northern Somalia military base to monitor activities in Yemen and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. In exchange, Israel is expected to recognize Somaliland, a self-declared republic that is currently unrecognized by the majority of the international community, which views it as part of Somalia. The prospect of official recognition has already sparked unease in Mogadishu, as it could bolster Somaliland's independence claims, further straining relations between Tel Aviv and Somalia. The potential for broader regional implications looms large, with both Israel and Ethiopia's moves in Somaliland threatening to upset the fragile balance in the Horn of Africa. So, again, big moves here on the Horn of Africa, and obviously talked about Israel wanting this to more closely monitor the Houthis, I believe. We know that they've been a big pain, so that base would coincide with Israel's base that they have on those Eritrean islands in the Red Sea, which, if people remember, the Houthis knocked the big Star of David, statue thing they had on the top of the mountain there on those islands. They bombed that and knocked it down. And so, we know Eritrea has this sort of alliance with Israel. I wonder if Israel recognizes Somaliland, if Israel will work to cool things down between Eritrea and Ethiopia, because again, they are ethnically similar. They're both, Oriental Orthodox Christians. So in theory, they would have more reasons to be aligned. But in many ways, Eritrea does exist just to cuck Ethiopia out of access to the sea. And we remember before the Somaliland deal really went through, this is a while back, maybe even a year now, that Ethiopia had put, tens of thousands of troops on the border with Eritrea, because there are some very small sections of Eritrea, maybe 20 miles wide, that Ethiopia's troops could have easily pushed through to the sea and gotten its access that way. So that's why there's a lot of tension between those countries. But perhaps Israel smooths those things out, and we've got a Judeo-Christian alliance against all the Muslims there in the region, which that's not exactly what I would like to see, because That would mean Ethiopia ultimately is allying against Russia because we know Russia is supporting the Sudanese government, and Russia is an ally of Egypt and all of these other places, which, again, Egypt is direct and Turkey are both directly involved in supporting Somalia. So, as members of, the broader Muslim community in the world. So, we're seeing how a lot of these countries, Egypt is, paid off by the U.S. to not be an enemy of Israel. But if Israel sides with Somaliland, Egypt are sending troops to Somalia to directly fight against Somaliland. Will Egypt and Israel clash in Africa, despite the fact that they share a border that Egypt obviously refuses to do anything to help the Palestinians on? They completely had their red lines trampled in Rafah and the Philadelphia crossing and Gaza in general. So maybe they'll make up for that with some bizarre connecting conflict in Somaliland with Ethiopia and Israel. But, we're getting a bit far afield at this point. I know that there are some situations with the church in Ukraine. We've talked about the videos of, people getting assaulted in those Banderite the Ukrainian imbeciles storming the cathedral in Cherkasy, and Metropolitan Theodosius getting attacked and assaulted, punched in the face, all this horrible things. And we know on the online there was all sorts of Ukrainian coping claiming that, it was actually the UOC people, the pro-Russians that initially stormed, the church and all this kind of nonsense, despite the fact that they were for multiple times defending against all of these assaults. But unless you have anything else to say about anything going on in Africa, Dimitri, we can talk about the persecution situation.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect transition, Conrad, from the unfortunate Judaizing Ethiopians, right, to the Judaizing Ukrainians, right, and the persecution of the church going on there. I think it's quite unfortunate what we saw 2 weeks ago during the storming of the Archangel Michael Cathedral, its capture, the desecration of the altar, the taking of various liturgical instruments, chalices, spoons, etc. Literally the robbing, or an Orthodox church taking its relics as well. The Ansimins, I believe, was taken, which again, this is what these Ukrainian Banderite, literally demoniacs do, which of course, if Orthodox Christian clergy are listening, you understand how important all of these sacred items are to church worship, and how unthinkable it is that former Orthodox Christians, even these Ukrainians, I guess, are supposed technically apostates or members of the church, how they probably know how significant these items are and exactly why they're taking them. It's still exactly unclear. But the big news of the week was Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy. This is the head of the Archangel Michael Cathedral, which was taken. We saw him defend against the Banderites. He has officially, a week after the event, excommunicated the mayor of Cherkasy, Anatoly Bondarenko, and this is the first official excommunication and anathematization of a Ukrainian politician by an Orthodox Christian bishop directly. And the reason why he did that was because right after the storming of the Archangel Michael Cathedral, which was completely sanctioned by the mayor of the city, which is why we did not see any Ukrainian official police show up to kind of essentially put down what was a lawless riot and a criminal act against an Orthodox Christian cathedral, right? And to protect the parishioners there, the police were told to stand down, and they allowed these Banderite, literally thieves, to rob the cathedral and essentially occupy it. But the mayor of Cherkasy, Anatoly Bondarenko, visited the local graveyard and put flowers to the grave of the previous bishop of Cherkasy, who was the bishop before Bishop Theodosius, and said, well, we wish you were alive today, then our church would not be occupied by Muscovites. So he had this Anatoly Bondarenko, publicized this clip of him visiting the Orthodox graveyard, essentially, bad-mouthing his current bishop. And Metropolitan Theodosius understood at that point that the mayor of his own city had completely gone over to the side of Satan and the Antichrist, and the only thing to do, even for Anatoly Bondarenko's own good, was to excommunicate him publicly so that people could view and see that this man is outside of the church. He has completely disconnected himself from the grace of God, and do not follow him, and he needs to come to repentance. This is what the point of excommunication is. It's not so much an act or a curse upon somebody as it is a proclamation that this person has left the church by his own wrongdoing, by his own will, which the mayor of Cherkasy has. And there were Orthodox Christian journalists who were saying, well, Pyotr Poroshenko should have been excommunicated as well because he caused the entire schism. But unfortunately, the Ukrainian Orthodox leadership of bishops is very much in a tight situation. We understand the occupation of a lot of these Orthodox Christian cathedrals and monasteries at the moment is putting the Ukrainian bishops into a tough situation, which is why the Ukrainian Orthodox Synod in Kiev, actually, Conrad, they came together a day after the sieging of this cathedral, which we all saw and viewed. I mean, horrible footage. And they did not release the minutes or the summary of their discussion at all, which we knew they discussed the sieging of the cathedral, but they did not issue a condemnation of it by the, a condemnation of the Ukrainian government, which, so we understand Metropolitan Onufri and those surrounding him, his essentially synod is under such pressure that they cannot even publicly condemn what we saw take place 2 weeks ago in Cherkasy, which I think is really showing you how extreme the persecution has become. We also saw crazy interviews, right? Like there was a Father Basil who says openly that he became a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church 5 years ago in order to subvert the church and make it anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. And he's giving an interview. Now he says, now that my mission is done and many of my flock have become anti-Russian, now I've joined the OCU, which is the Church of Metropolitan Onufri. So you literally have these snakes, people who have become clergy in order to push political ideologies along. I mean, I cannot think of probably deadlier sins than that. These people are playing with their own souls and the souls of others in order to spread, essentially diabolical ideas across the Ukrainian land. So Father Basil here, or shall I say former Father Basil, who probably shouldn't have been made a priest in the first case, is one of those examples. And the other interesting thing in the entire SMO zone, Conrad, as we see sort of the Russian diocese expand and I suppose the authority of the Moscow Synod and Patriarch Kirill as well expand on this land of now, formerly the Ukrainian state, we see the Metropolitan of Donetsk actually be replaced. So the former Metropolitan of Donetsk, Hilarion, was sent officially into retirement. I'm not too sure. I can't really badmouth him or say anything about him, positive or negative. But from what we understand and from what certain people in Donetsk have been saying, he hasn't held the most, say, pro-Russian patriotic positions throughout the entire SMO process. And simply that's because he's a former resident of Lvov, so he comes from very far western Ukraine. It's quite curious why he was made the Bishop of Donetsk in the first place, but he was sent into an early retirement, it seems, by the official statement of the Russian Synod from Moscow. And now he's living in Crimea, actually, next to Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov, which is probably not the worst place to be, one of the nicest places in Russia, I would say, in order to have a retirement there. The new Metropolitan of Donetsk, which is such a key city, I suppose, in today's geopolitical outlook, is the former Metropolitan of Vladivostok. So from all the way far east Siberia, from the coast of the Pacific Ocean, he travels to Donetsk, and that is Metropolitan Vladimir of Donetsk, the new hierarch.
As far away from Lvov as possible, literally.
Right, exactly. I mean, we're literally transferring bishops from across the world, thousands of kilometers, to different dioceses. I mean, we know the Russian church had these strange traditions going back to the Russian imperial times, even before that to the Russian Tsardom, where they had bishops, migrating seas and moving from diocese to diocese. I'm not sure how exactly canonical that is or how traditional, but that's simply one of the Russian traditions we see throughout church history over the last 600 years. So it's kind of continuing today. But I think it's quite good, a brave move by Metropolitan Theodosius, openly excommunicating a pro-Ukrainian, essentially demoniac politician, Anatoly Bondarenko. I mean, more of this should take place. I think this is a call to arms for all Orthodox bishops. Do not be afraid to, if there are politicians who proclaim themselves Orthodox, you need to hold them to a certain standard of your church. You are, of course, a bishop. There are only 800, 900 Orthodox Christian bishops in the world. These are the apostles of the church. They have a particular role to guard the church from these wolves pretending to be members of the laity or members of the clergy. And this is I would say, quite a based move. Metropolitan Theodosius is really, despite his general neutrality on the entire SMO question and position, he's becoming one of my sort of favorite hierarchs in the church for these very strong moves. And the recent footage of him defending the cathedral, I mean, it literally, he's like a hierarch of the early church, very fantastic. And despite the loss of the cathedral, I think it's really valiant footage and really uplifting, I think, for all of us Orthodox Christians in the 21st century.
It's very unfortunate, and we hope that the election in America, which again, obviously that's ongoing. This is, I think, our second to last episode before the 2024 election in America. We hope that will dramatically impact the situation in Ukraine to where the persecution will stop and Russia will be able to gain more territory and the regime in Ukraine will fall. And again, like we said, the persecution will come to an end. That is, when I think of the Ukrainian regime falling, that's the most important thing I think that would immediately happen. And there would need to be protection on the street for these churches if there was any lawlessness, because we know that these gangs and these Banderites and these Ukrainian nationalists would immediately target Ukrainian Orthodox Church sites and whatnot. And we are seeing more deranged Westoids targeting the church. This is from Ortho Christian, and this is from Estonia. The Estonian Orthodox Church is coming under fire again. I'm going to read the article here. It says the Estonian Ministry of the Interior has seriously ramped up its pressure on the Estonian Orthodox Church as Minister Lauri Läänemets has proposed new legislation to ban religious organizations connected to the Moscow Patriarchate. The move directly targets the Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate because, according to Läänemets, it has not taken seriously enough steps to separate itself from the Patriarchate, which the minister described as clearly another weapon in the arsenal of Russian influence. The church amended its statutes in August in response to state demands, removing all references to subordination to the statutes of the Moscow Patriarchate. The ministry then sent the synod a letter arguing that this wasn't enough. His Grace Bishop Daniil of Tartu responded that the state should stop pretending to have competency in canonical matters. Speaking before Parliament, Läänemets argued that the country can't tolerate the Estonian Church's continued affiliation with the Moscow Patriarchate, which was previously declared by Parliament to be an organization supporting terrorist warfare, a charge the Estonian Church has repeatedly rejected and formally appealed. This legislative push follows the February 2024 expulsion of Metropolitan Evgeny of Tallinn and All Estonia, the head of the EOC MP since 2018, after authorities refused to extend his residence permit. Officials have openly acknowledged more than once that they have detected no actual threat from the church, but argued that the Metropolitan failed to condemn the war in Ukraine. However, Metropolitan Evgeny was, in fact, signatory to a March 2022 statement from the Estonian Council of Churches that denounced the war. The Ministry of the Interior's proposed amendments to the law on churches and congregations would prohibit any religious organization in Estonia from maintaining ties with foreign organizations that threaten public order, support military aggression, or incite terrorism. Additionally, the law would bar individuals from serving as clergy or board members if they have proven connections to religious organizations acting against Estonian state interests. With this legal change, Estonia unequivocally declares that religious freedom goes hand in hand with constitutional order. Those that don't meet these criteria or don't wish to meet them have no place in Estonian religious life, Läänemets stated, while emphasizing that the government's aim is not to shut down any parishes or monasteries. Instead, he indicated that religious organizations will be given the opportunity to bring their activities into compliance with the new law should it pass. The minister stressed that while the immediate focus is on the Moscow Patriarchate's influence, the law would also prevent future situations where local religious organizations could be controlled by malicious foreign spiritual leaders, which I love the doublespeak there at the end. It's like, we are standing firm for religious freedom, which means that if you don't agree with us, you don't deserve religious freedom. Like, it's just complete ridiculous nonsense. And of course, the whole situation with Metropolitan Evgeny, who Dmitry has mentioned a lot, who is residing in Pskov, I believe at the Pskov Caves Monastery, as he is not allowed back in Estonia. So he has other metropolitans under him sort of speaking on his behalf, like Metropolitan Daniil. And again, it seems that the Moscow Patriarchate trusts the bishops of Estonia enough to allow them to, again, obviously Metropolitan Evgeny is not being persecuted in Russia for signing on to that Council of Churches document, obviously removing any mention in their bylaws. The Russian church isn't punishing them for that, much in the same way that the Russian church is not punishing people like Metropolitan Theodosius, Metropolitan Onufry, and whatnot, who are undergoing what they're undergoing in Ukraine. But yeah, we're reaching the end of the show here. The only other news I have is that China seems to be warning the Myanmar resistance to not push its luck against the junta. So there's a tiny bit of good news, I guess, amidst a fairly black-pilling episode of church news. But again, as Russia advances, we know that more and more territory will be free from Ukrainian persecution, which we love to see. So I don't know if you have any last words, Dmitry, but we will land this plane.
Yeah, I think just finally, regarding the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which again is a pivotal point in our entire podcast, I believe. In Kursk specifically, Putin officially stated that Russians have surrounded 2,000 Ukrainian infantrymen in the northwestern part of the Kursk Oblast. And these particular 2,000 personnel may, in fact, actually surrender in the next few weeks, as Putin has proclaimed. They've been completely surrounded by the Russian forces. We did speak about this last week broadly, that there were a couple of Ukrainian battalions which were seemingly, falling to a Russian cauldron. But Putin officially, in the BRICS summit, officially announced that, the commander of the Ukrainian forces, Syrsky, proclaimed that this was fake news and that Russia, in fact, did not surround the Ukrainian forces. And Syrsky, in sort of an opposition, released news that we have statistics of how many Russians we slew and killed in the Ukrainian conflict in Kursk. And this was, he said, up to 6,600 Russians were killed in the fight in the Kursk Oblast. 711 were captured as POWs, and this is quite big, 45 tanks, were destroyed by the Ukrainian forces. Again, compare this in contrast to the statistics given by Hezbollah, and clearly, like even Hezbollah, which is not even a proper state actor, are giving statistics which appear even more realistic and proper. But despite the fact that, whatever the real numbers are on the ground in the Kursk Oblast, Conrad, I think the most unfortunate thing happening there is of course, the imprisonment of Russian civilians as well as Russian conscripts, personnel, soldiers, because we know the Ukrainians abuse their prisoners quite intensely. We know the Ukrainians torture them in various basements. There's all kinds of horror stories coming out of Ukraine. We know that prisoners die under Ukrainian so-called prison care. And we also know that they literally promote anti-Orthodox Christian propaganda in the POW camps by simply not providing Orthodox Christian literature and promoting sectarianism, other cult religions and Protestantism, Unionism, all kinds of weird things. So it's a spiritual battle on the front lines of Kursk as much as it is a battle of steel and lead. And I think this is the general message. This is what we've kind of come to understand as soon as the Ukrainians entered into the Kursk Oblast and they began bombing the churches. We quickly, I think, understood exactly what was happening in this particular area. So we'll keep you posted as this situation develops.
Indeed, we will, as well as we will keep you posted on the developing situation in the Levant if there are more Iranian strikes and whatnot. And if you want to see that, be sure to follow us on the relevant socials. Obviously, worldwarnow.co is the Substack. You can get behind the paywall and listen to our latest Ether Hour episode with Luigi. We talk about Orthodox apologetics and the growth of Orthodoxy in America. You can also ask us a question in our latest Q&A thread, which will be linked below, as will the Luigi episode. So be sure to click the link to that Q&A thread, get behind the paywall, and ask us a question that will be answered in our next Ether Hour episode, which will be a Q&A. We're going to answer a lot of your questions, so get ready for that. It's good. Ask whatever you want about World War III, my travels in the past, other comments we've made. If there's something we've said that you want us to elaborate on, be sure to ask us about it, and we will be sure to do that. Ask us about saints that we like, other historical events that you may think that we're interested in, that we may have strong opinions about. We certainly have strong opinions on those kinds of things. So be sure to check all of that out at the links down below. And again, to hear all of the latest updates, be sure to follow us on places like X, World War Now _. Follow me as well at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. We do live streams and whatnot. We post videos there. There's the great pixel art that you can look at while you watch and everything. But again, worldwarnow.co, that is the Substack. That's the home base where all the Ether Hours, all the World War Nows, all the articles that, again, we've got some big articles coming your way. So be sure to join the 20,000 plus email subscribers on the Substack and get everything, the articles, get the Ether Hours, get it all in your inbox immediately whenever it drops. So again, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Thank you so much for following us through World War III for all of this time. And for you that support us, behind the paywall, thank you. Especially you are the ones that make all of this possible. So again, thank you so much for listening, and God bless. We will see you on the next one.